Last August, Congresswoman Nikki Saugus announced that she would be retiring from the U.S. House of Representatives at the end of this term. That decision set off a flurry of announcements that has resulted in one of the most crowded field of candidates that this area has ever seen. Over a dozen candidates will face off in the Democratic primary on September 4th to face Republican Rick Hill of Pepperell. While Flap TV will cover all candidates in this race from beginning to end, we also recognize the logistical impossibility of having all 13 of those candidates on one stage for a debate. So we have talked to political consultants, we've looked at polling numbers, fundraising numbers, and media representatives, and narrowed this field to the top 4 candidates. We've invited all 4 of those candidates on stage today to talk to you. All 4 of those candidates have accepted our invitation. Here's a little bit about them.
Rufus Gifford, 43 years old, of Concord, Massachusetts, graduated St. Paul's School in Concord, New Hampshire, and is an alumni of Brown University in Rhode Island. Married to Dr. Stephen DeVincent since 2015. Gifford spent some time in Hollywood as a producer before moving on to politics. After working on John Kerry's presidential campaign in 2004, he started his own political consulting business. He served as finance director for the Democratic National Committee and then moved on to become national finance director of President Obama's 2012 re-election campaign, where he was responsible for raising a record $1 billion. In 2013, President Obama nominated Gifford to be the United States ambassador to Denmark. After being confirmed by the Senate, Gifford served in that role for the remainder of the Obama presidency. On January 16, 2017, Gifford was awarded the Grand Cross of the Order of Dannebrog by Queen Margrethe II for his meritorious service to the Kingdom of Denmark. Dan Coe, 33 years old, from Andover, Massachusetts, received his MBA from Harvard University and is married to Amy Sinnett since 2016. As a high school student, Coe interned for the late Senator Ted Kennedy and later worked as an advisor for Mayor Tom Menino, where he focused on the mayor's Summer Jobs Program, an initiative to bring 10,000 summer jobs to youth in the area. Coe began his career working in executive search and management consulting in the private sector, including the Huffington Post. After serving as chief of staff to Arianna Huffington, he became the first general manager for Huffington Post Live. When Marty Walsh was elected mayor of Boston in 2014, the mayor appointed Coe as his chief of staff. Coe and his wife Amy have run in dozens of marathons, including the 2015 Boston Marathon, where Coe proposed to Amy after they crossed the finish line. In the 2018 Boston Marathon, Coe finished a very respectable 3 hours and 31 minutes. Lori Trahan, 44 years old, from Westford, Massachusetts, alumni of Georgetown University, married to David Trahan. Trahan started working early, at age 11, delivering newspapers in her hometown of Lowell and serving breakfast at the Owl Diner while juggling high school and varsity sports. She earned a scholarship to play volleyball at Georgetown University, where she went on to earn a Bachelor of Science degree in Comparative and Regional Studies at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. After college, she began working for Congressman Marty Meehan, where she rose quickly through the ranks, becoming Meehan's chief of staff. After a decade working in Congress, she became an executive at an early-stage high-tech company in Cambridge, and then, 6 years ago, started a business consulting firm with 2 other women. Lori lives with her husband David, a home builder in Westford, where they are raising their 5 children. State Senator Barbara L'Italian, 57 years old, from Andover, Massachusetts. She earned her degree in political science from Merrimack College and is married to Kevin Hall. L'Italian was raised in Andover along with 7 siblings. She is the daughter of a school teacher and an FBI agent. After graduating from Andover High School, she worked full-time to put herself through college, graduating from Merrimack College with a degree in political science. She worked for Elder Services of Merrimack Valley as a case manager, and then with the Greater Lawrence Psychological Center, working the Elder Abuse Hotline for intakes and referrals. In 2002, she became the first state representative to represent the 18th Essex District, which was created by redistricting following the 2000 census. She served in that seat for 4 terms. After her time in the House, she became Director of Government Affairs for then State Treasurer Steve Grossman. L'Italian was elected to the Massachusetts State Senate in 2014, where she currently serves as chair of the Joint Committee on Consumer Protection and the Joint Committee on Elder Affairs.
So those are the top 4 candidates, and they are all live in our studio today to talk to you and make their case on why they are the best candidate to represent you in the United States Congress. Let's go have those conversations right now. Hello, welcome to Flap TV, and welcome to our candidates that join us here live in studio at FATV. And the sooner we get into it, the more topics we're going to get to. So let's get right into it. As we know, the real work of Congress isn't done there on the House floor where everyone's yapping. It's done in committees where they're doing the work. So if you are elected to Congress, which committee are you going to lobby to be on, and why? Ambassador Gifford.
It's so hard to choose one, but for me it would start with Foreign Affairs, simply because I did have the experience as ambassador, and to see the Trump administration fundamentally dismantle our diplomatic community, the war that he's waged on the State Department. I do think we need people in Congress who understand the true value of diplomacy, understand that with that value comes a need for funding and a need for leadership. And so that would be first. But I also, it's so hard to pick one. You know, for me, energy, I'm very, very interested in energy. I'm very, very interested in science and technology. I have a plan to bring green jobs to this district, which I think not only helps save the climate, but also creates real, meaningful, lasting manufacturing jobs for the 3rd District of Massachusetts. So those are at the top of my mind, but also knowing that, you know, any freshman, you don't necessarily get to choose everything you want. But I'm just ready to get there and ready to fight. So thanks.
Mr. Coe.
Thank you. Well, you know, my family comes from 2 different parts of this world, Korea and Lebanon, and they live the American dream. So I think the committees, we need to make sure that we're fighting and standing for the values that we believe in that make the American dream possible for all. For me, that's appropriations. As Chief of Staff to the City of Boston and Mayor Walsh, I saw every day how good, responsible appropriations of money that fits to our values creates a much better society for everyone. So that means making sure that we have funding for good, well-paying jobs and that we're protecting people in their jobs, making sure that we have money for universal health care, making sure that we are funding the green agenda that makes sure that we are taking care of our planet. All of those things that are crucially crucial for the progress of this district is all about where the money is flowing from the federal government. As someone who saw that every day, I think we need to be much smarter about it, and we need to be making sure that we're standing up to the Trump administration with the proper investment of resources.
Senator L'Italian.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to give you 2 committees. I want to be on the committee that oversees healthcare and the committee that oversees education. So I started my journey as a legislator 15 years ago, predicated on my son with autism and his need for health insurance coverage, took those advocacy skills to the State House and was able to create an insurance mandate for folks with autism and have helped tens of thousands of people in this state. I want to bring that advocacy down to Washington. I also have been endorsed on behalf of those who believe that we need to move towards a Medicare for All program, and with the Mass Nurses endorsement as well, because I believe that healthcare is a great equalizer. Same with education. I would like to be on the Education Committee. I've served on my school committee in my hometown, and I've been on education in the House and in the Senate, and I've done a lot of work with regards to special education funding, working on dyslexia right now, because that's a whole generation of kids that struggle to read and pass tests and succeed. So I really would love to go on healthcare and education committees.
Mr. Head.
Thank you. So for me, we have a long history of serving on the House Armed Services Committee. It's not lost on me for a second that this Commonwealth relies on the $12 billion in funding that the committee delivers here. That not only bolsters our regional economy, but it's a lot of jobs. It's a lot of jobs in this district and certainly all over the state. That committee also gives you an enormous opportunity to provide oversight of this administration, which I think we need. You know, if the president had it his way, this budget, he would have had $62 billion in military spending. And I think we need a check on those programs because they are squeezing out so many of the social programs and the health care programs that we rely on as a country. So House Armed Services Committee, and then I do get a second committee, and so education and labor is one that's important to me as well.
Great. All the candidates driving here to Fitchburg, I'm guessing you hit at least one pothole.
Goodness.
True that.
You know, it's tough. New England winter is very hilly cities, and I'm sure it's like that throughout the district. There is talk in Congress, and the administration is actually also talking about an increase in the gas tax. So we need to get money for infrastructure, but we also have working people that are struggling to pay bills. So would you support, as a member of Congress, an increase in the federal gas tax in order to fund infrastructure improvements? Mr. Coe.
Well, first of all, we need to have a comprehensive infrastructure plan in this country. You know, President Trump talked a lot about a comprehensive plan with a lot of investment, but turns out there was very little federal money involved in that. As someone who worked as a city administrator, I saw firsthand how little resources there actually were for people, and we need to make sure that we're actually providing the resources to fix the streets of places like Fitchburg. Mayor DiNatale tells me it would take tens of millions of dollars to repave the streets the way we want to in Fitchburg. So we need to look at all different ways to be able to provide infrastructure in the right ways. I think first, though, before we look at a gas tax, we actually need to make sure we're closing loopholes for the fossil fuel industry, for example, that are currently getting tax breaks that is unnecessary that could be applied towards infrastructure. Because at the end of the day, we are becoming less competitive as a country and less competitive as a district without that smart infrastructure investment, and we need to double down on it because that's how people can truly live the American dream.
Senator?
Thank you. You know, driving here to the station, we overshot the parking lot and went up another block and had to turn around. And boy, the street's in really rough shape, just a quarter of a mile up the street here. Starting with a gas tax is the absolute wrong approach. We need to start by looking at our taxation system and going back and changing the really harmful tax bill that was passed last year. It really benefited the richest Americans and is leaving the rest of us behind. And so I would not look at leading with a gas tax under any circumstances. Also, with what's just happened with the Iran deal, chances are our gas, which has been creeping up over the last couple of weeks, is going to continue to creep up. So I do think that we need to have a real infrastructure program, not one that Trump has unveiled that relies heavily on state matches. You know, the state is strapped too. We put out Chapter 90 money, and that's clearly not enough. We need a tax system that works and that really prioritizes the everyday working people that are driving on these streets.
Mr. Han.
Thank you. Certainly, we need an infrastructure bill. I'll echo what my colleagues have said here, and it's probably one of the things that we're most disheartened about as we saw this president's campaign on certain things to benefit our economy and hardworking men and women in this district and beyond. And the fact that we've just silently walked away from that, and he has silently walked away from that infrastructure commitment is incredibly disheartening. So I think that I'm not for a federal gas tax. I think that only puts more hardship on working class families with gas prices eclipsing $3 per gallon. I don't think that we want the hardworking men and women of this country shouldering that burden. I would be for a carbons or emission tax on our biggest corporations and our largest polluters as a way to fund infrastructure projects.
Ambassador.
Well, let's just start talking about the need here. Is that we're sitting here in Fitchburg. There are 42 bridges in Fitchburg, 42. And the mayor tells me as well that every one of them could probably use a little help and some federal money to actually improve them. I think Fitchburg is also the second, which surprised me when I first came here, it's the second hilliest city in the country after San Francisco, which also comes with a certain amount of infrastructure needs. So absolutely, the district needs some infrastructure money, and your next congressperson should absolutely be advocating for infrastructure money. So that's where we are on this. The president put out a bill that was 5-to-1 private investment versus public investment. To me, we need to get that investment 1-to-1, meaning as close to 1-to-1 as possible. If we are going to put forward an aggressive infrastructure spending bill, then we need to have some skin in the game, that the federal government needs to have some skin in the game, and that's what I would advocate for. A gas tax, look, I think that the need here needs to put everything on the table. I would not start with a gas tax. I think it is the wrong approach to start with, but we got to have it on the table, because the more important thing here is that we get a big, fat infrastructure spending bill where the federal government's investing real money in our communities.
Very good. Currently, under federal law, if you have a medical marijuana card, you cannot purchase a firearm. I know from reading about this group of candidates, you're not big fans of firearms, but you're okay with medical marijuana. So you have the two conflicting points here. So should someone, as a member of Congress, do you believe that someone that has a medical marijuana card should be prohibited from purchasing a firearm for that reason alone? Senator.
Yeah, I would say that absolutely not. Medical marijuana usage and a card should not be a preclusion to owning a gun, but I'll tell you what should be a preclusion. If you are suffering from a pervasive mental illness and you are a danger and at risk to yourself or others, and that's why I support and have co-sponsored the red flag bill that we will take up next month in the state Senate. Anyone who has been convicted of domestic violence or assault, anyone with a criminal record, all of these folks should have no business having access to a gun. And furthermore, I believe very strongly that while I'm supportive of all my hunters and my sportsmen, and I have a gun club in every one of my current communities in the state Senate, I believe that no one should have access to assault weapons. Those are weapons of war, and they ought to only be in the hands of uniformed officers or military.
Mr. Hand.
Thank you. No, I don't think that a medical marijuana license should preclude someone from owning a gun on that basis alone. Look, we just need common sense gun reform in this country. Students from Parkland have marched. We need to heed the call. This is not about taking Second Amendment rights away from responsible gun owners. This is about reinstituting the assault weapon ban. This is for background checks that make sense. If you can't fly airplanes, you probably shouldn't be able to own a gun. If you are of harm to yourself or to others, I think we can all agree that you needn't have a gun. And certainly, we need more research on this issue. I think that's one of the things I'd like to understand more is because we don't have enough research from the CDC or from the federal government on, in general, on the impact of guns on our public health and on our society. These decisions to constrain what we do with our gun laws is completely arbitrary.
I agree. I agree with what my colleague said here. I do not believe a medical marijuana card should be a preclusion for buying a firearm. And it sort of speaks to the problem of the system all told, right? That this is what we are focusing on. When we have 90% of the country, 90% by many estimations, saying that they want Congress to approve things like universal background checks, which would do the sorts of things that my colleagues here have mentioned, things like looking at mental illness making sure states are sharing information with each other, so that if someone tries to buy a firearm in another state and they may have a mental health record in their home state, that they are still not able to buy a firearm. This is common sense, and this is why and there's so many ways why people don't trust Congress, because you have 90% of our population insisting on one policy, and yet we still cannot get a vote in Congress. Cannot get a vote. Because, as we all know, Congress in so many ways is bought by the NRA, and we simply need to change that.
Mr. Coe?
We have a president right now who is literally ignoring the population that all want common sense gun safety in this country. That means banning bump stocks. That means banning assault weapons. That means universal background checks. No one is suggesting anything crazy here. This is common sense. And the reality is what the Parkland kids did was absolutely incredible. But now that the stage has been taken down, it's up to us to make sure we keep that momentum, that we get to the Congress people who are the swing votes and hold them accountable in the same way that we saved the ACA. We need to do the same thing to enact this common sense gun reform in our country. The NRA is buying off politicians. They are literally paying them to betray the constituents that they're supposedly there to represent. That is wrong. So instead of talking about medical marijuana licenses and stopping people from owning a gun as a result, we need to fight and actually enact common sense gun safety once and for all while this momentum is going, so that no kid and nobody in this country is going to die for unnecessary gun violence, which is happening right now in this country, and it's wrong.
North Korea has released U.S. prisoners, halted their nuclear testing, and ended their war with South Korea. This coming after successful coordinated missile strikes with our allies in Syria in response to the Assad regime's chemical attacks. But on the other side, we've also seen the withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal and the withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord. So just looking at foreign policy alone, what grade would you give this administration from A to F, Mr. Han?
Yeah, I've taken a lot of heat for my grading of folks. But I look, on the one hand, what's happening on the Korean Peninsula today is a step in the right direction, right? And I don't think we can take anything away from that. Anybody who wants to see nuclear non-proliferation, that is movement in the right direction, and I want to remain optimistic that we handle that responsibly. But I give this president an F on foreign policy. As someone who went to the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University and went to school with so many career diplomats and foreign service officers, the way he has gutted the State Department, the way he has taken us out of the Paris Climate Accord and ended our leadership on global climate change, the way he has antagonized our allies over and over again and removed us from the Iran nuclear deal, which will destabilize the entire region and our national security. He doesn't deserve anything more than an F. You know, we all read The Art of the Deal, but I think what we probably took away from the president's negotiating tactics is that he has used bankruptcy law to not pay his subcontractors. He negotiates by bullying. And that's not what's warranted right here. These are complex issues that we have allies to help us work through, and there's a lot of interconnectivity with what we do as a world leader, and we need more thoughtful approaches to our diplomacy.
Ambassador.
Obviously, I feel strongly about this. I'm going to give him a D, and this is why. I would give him an F, but I'm actually going to remain cautiously, very cautiously optimistic about the Korea situation. I think we can't help but acknowledge in this moment, especially after we release the 3 prisoners, and the fact that it seems to be that they are coming to the table. I have enormous skepticism about this, but I'm going to give him a D. It's the only reason I'm not giving him an F, because on everything else, whether it's the Paris Climate Agreement, the Iran deal, or just the true decimation of the American brand overseas, meaning the fact that we do not have ambassadors in places like South Korea, the fact that we have slashed funding for the State Department, including the policies that actually made America great. Look, this America First foreign policy, which is what they talk about. It sounds good, but it's a political slogan. It's not a foreign policy. For example, when he was pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement, he essentially said, this is a bad economic deal for the United States of America. Why? Because we were putting in more money and not getting it back. This is why you don't elect a business person president of the United States, because foreign policy, historically, for the last 75 years has been based on values. Think about what Donald Trump would have said about the Marshall Plan. probably the greatest example of American foreign policy in the modern era. This is values-based leadership. And I do believe that Donald Trump's foreign policy is actually undermining everything that actually made America great.
Mr. Coe.
Yeah, thank you. This is about America's leadership in the world and what we want our reputation to be. Do we want to be promoting peace, or do we want to be seen through the lens of Donald Trump? This is really personal for me as a Korean American. Research has shown that if Kim Jong-un wanted to, within minutes he could launch ballistic missiles at the capital of Seoul, and within seconds millions of people would be dead, one of those people being my aunt. And so instead of engaging him on a productive level, I give this president an F, because the real things that I have seen so far from him is literally making fun of Kim Jong-un's weight, threatening him with warfare. I have not seen the logical steps necessary to truly get to peace. For as far as what's going on in the peninsula, if you actually look at the situation there, Park Geun-hye was a hawk. She did not want to work with Kim Jong-un. She was actually thrown out of her position as president. Moon Jae-in came in and enacted the Sunshine Policy that warmed up to Kim Jong-un and normalized those relations to an extent with this meeting. There is much to be seen before we can give this president any credit for any kind of peace in the peninsula. And I completely agree, whether it comes to the Paris Climate Accords, whether it comes to what's happening with the Iran deal. These are issues that are of huge concern, that hurt our status in the world. I am fortunate to have the support of UN Ambassador Samantha Power, who's a Concord resident. She said that State Department applications for this Foreign Service exam dropped 50% after President Trump came into office. That should scare all of us, because we should be proud to be Americans. We should be proud to be following the leadership. But the reality is this leadership leaves us nothing to be proud of, and we can't stand for it, because every single day our status and our reputation in this world gets worse.
Senator.
Thank you. I would give an F, plain and simple. I believe that what's happened in Korea, although we are to laud the release of those 3 prisoners, 2 of whom were taken captive under the President Trump administration, we can't forget Otto Warmbier and his death. I mean, North Korea is still a human rights abuser. I believe because they've attained nuclear capability, they now are enjoying what they believe to be the perception in the world that they're on the same stage with the United States. And so while they are no longer going to be doing tests, they're already there in terms of capability. And I believe it had much more to do with China really tightening the noose on them than anything that we did. It certainly had nothing to do with comparing the size of our nuclear button or engaging in any other, brinksmanship that the president is engaged in. In terms of the Iran deal, that was really the signature diplomatic achievement of the last decade. And to see us walk away from that with grave consequences for peace, but also for the economies of the EU, who are still involved in this, are still trying to salvage this, and companies that are not going to be able to engage in contracts they had. I know Boeing is one of them. I heard that VW is one of them for Germany. There are grave consequences here. And I do not believe, despite the fact that it was great political theater, and thank God on a human level, those 3 people were, returned to our country this week. But there's a lot more that needs to happen, and I really fear that when the meeting takes place in Singapore, if Trump doesn't get every single thing he wants, and he has set those stakes high based on his reasoning for backing out of the Iran deal, that my guess is he's going to fly off the handle and walk away. And so this is not a certainty. There's so much more that needs to happen, and I absolutely agree that you can't have diplomacy without diplomats filling the State Department.
Bills are about compromise, and it is said that the best compromise is, you have a good compromise when everybody is unhappy about something. Mm-hmm. So going into Congress, where you're dealing with, 434 other members, give us an example of something that you strongly oppose, but you would be willing to concede in order to get something you strongly support. Ambassador.
Yeah, it's such a tough question to answer in a vacuum, but it's but I agree with the concept of your question. So the example I'll give is the border wall. In my mind, the border wall is everything we should not be doing. I think it's a waste of money. I think it's racist. I think it's xenophobic. I think it speaks to the most far right populations in our country. And I think because, as honestly, someone who served as an ambassador, I also know that the vast majority of undocumented immigrants immigrants in this country have come through overstayed visas. They haven't come over any wall. So to actually, if you want to really try to fight undocumented immigration, you got to do something about that and not spend $40 billion on a wall. Now, would I, hypothetically, if Donald Trump came to the Democratic Congress and said, I am going to give you universal health care if you give me funding for the border wall, I would say yes, because at some point you got to say, look, what matters more? And to me, providing universal health care for all Americans is a greater value add than what I think is an enormous waste of money on the border wall. Now, is that a somewhat crazy example, considering the fact that we'd have to figure out how to pay for both? Of course it is. But it's the kind of thing that I would engage in.
Mr. Coe.
Yeah, and I appreciate the question. I'm going to respectfully disagree with the premise of it. I think we've seen for so long, and especially under this president so far, Democrats continuously backing themselves into a corner where they are compromising on their core values. This is about the future of our country, and we can never compromise on our core values. When it comes to issues, we need to make sure we are remaining steadfast to be able to keep the American dream alive with universal health care, with making sure that people are having a good job. We backed ourselves into a corner when it came to compromising between DACA or the wall, or with the children's health insurance program or the wall. That is wrong. Now, if the president wants to roll out a comprehensive infrastructure plan where Montana gets a big chunk and Massachusetts gets a big chunk, I'm okay with that. But the reality is this president has not given me any indication that he has any of the people in mind in this district's best interests. And that is wrong, and we need to be fighting back against that and continuing to push the Democratic agenda so that we're not compromising the issues that matter most.
Senator LaTallian.
Thank you. Having been a legislator over the last 15 years, I have to say that I'm not going to engage in naivete, and as was just previously stated, and state that there aren't times where you have to have give and take. You do have to have give and take. It happens all the time. I'm reminded of the quote, "Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good." We could have had universal health care back during the Nixon administration, but Ted Kennedy didn't like the deal, so it didn't happen, and it took another 20 years plus for that to happen. When I had to pass an insurance mandate for autism coverage for kids that were going without, that weren't being left behind, their parents were second mortgaging their homes. Some people were going without because they didn't have the ability to do that. I wanted to get it all in one fell swoop back in 2010, and I wasn't able to get the entire thing. So I got as much as I possibly could, and that was a compromise. I got private insurance coverage. I could not get the Mass Health piece all at once, and so I took what I could. And honestly, if you've been a legislator and you understand how this works, you do understand that it's about making compromises, it's about making trade-offs, and it's about advancing the ball forward. And so, interestingly enough, able to get half of what I wanted back in 2010, and in 2014 was able to get the second half. And so I disagree with the premise that you are giving away your values to try to come up with middle ground and try to advance the ball. And that, sadly, is what's happened, and that's why things aren't getting done in Washington. Everyone retreats to their respective corners, and nothing gets done, and that will not be me. And as a legislator, I'm the only one at this table that can say that I've actually had to forge compromises to get things done for the better of people.
Mr. Han.
Well, that's actually not true, that Senator LaTallian's the only person who's actually had to forge partnerships and find common ground, because I was a chief of staff to a congressman, and we actually co-authored and passed the most significant campaign finance reform bill, and that was a bipartisan bill. I mean, what we started with, which was, you know, a very comprehensive view of reform, is not what we ended with, and that's what you have to do when you are going to work with your partners, whether it's in your own party or across the aisle, to pass something that makes sense and that takes the corruptive influence of money out of politics. So I do have experience doing that. I was a chief of staff and helped usher that legislation through several Congresses because it took that kind of effort. It is a tough question to answer today. What would your compromises be? You know, a lot of times we do have a view of compromise, and we look at a fixed pie, and there are winners and losers. I don't look at it that way. I feel like we have to think of ways of growing the pie so that more people benefit, not that we have winners and losers. I mean, right now, I am not a fan of adding more money to our national deficit. I mean, we're already going to hit the trillion mark in 2020, and that's 2 years ahead of schedule. That's frightening. As a woman who has 3 grown sons and 2 young daughters, the idea and the notion of kicking the can down for our future generations to pay for is frightening. But what do I want to see when we win in November? I want to see us, fund the programs that we have a moral obligation to provide to our seniors and to our working class Americans through Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, education, and I think an infrastructure bill. I mean, the president has already said that he is not going to add to our deficit, even though he has promised that during our campaign. I would actually, I would want to. That is a trade-off I would make. I would actually fund that bill so that we can create jobs in our economy in this district, put working class people to work, and revitalize our cities and towns in the process.
You've all raised some serious dough in this campaign, and you're going to be spending it on ads and everything else, telling us all about all your accomplishments. So for free, I'm not even going to charge you for this. I'm going to let you guys tell me a time that you failed at something. What was it? What did you learn from it, Mr. Coe?
Yeah, this is something that is personal for me. When I was growing up, obviously growing up in a household that, especially with an Asian American family, there's a certain dedication to academic excellence, and I struggled. A lot of people had trouble with reading. I had trouble disciplining myself to sit down to read. It wasn't until I was 14, which is relatively late in a child's life, in which I was diagnosed with ADHD, and it was an incredibly difficult time in my life, both because I had trouble focusing and I knew I wasn't doing well in school, but also I was on medication for it, and I didn't want my fellow students to know, because there's such a stigma attached with a learning disability, so much so that when I would take my medication, because it would only last 4 hours, I would go into a bathroom stall so no one would see it. It was a huge struggle. The only reason why I was able to eventually view it as a strength is because I had teachers who were able to look past the idea that here's a kid in the back who's not getting it the first time, here's the kid who looks like he's not focused, and actually reached out to me and spent the time and dedicated and investing the energy in making sure that I was able to see this as a strength. That is why empowering our teachers is so important. That's why investing in education is so important, because there are so many kids, quite frankly, like me, who are struggling right now in school. And you have to make sure that you're giving the resource to the teachers to be able to invest that time like they fortunately were able to do with me.
Senator?
Thank you. I'm going to say 2 things. One is that growing up as one of 8 children in a very strict French-Canadian-Irish household, I was very much a perfectionist like my dad. And he was a self-made guy, came from Lawrence, from a triple-decker, and made his way because of serving in World War II in the GI Bill, able to become an FBI agent. So I was very much a perfectionist like my dad. I would say that approach really failed as a mom, particularly for my first child, because of his autism, because of the way he looked at the world. He was really challenging in terms of his behaviors, in terms of his communication. I had to rethink what was most important in my life. And it wasn't holding on to this vague notion of being able to control every aspect of my life. It really was what was going to best help that child in particular, and then my other 3 as well. So I'd say personally, understanding that I had to ease up, I had to really think about what was most important in terms of values. Professionally, I would say the biggest failure, I was a co-chair of an override to fund the school system in Andover back in 2002. I gave it my all, as did my co-chair. I believed that we needed more money to open up a brand new school and make sure that we had sufficient staffing and all the things that go into opening up a new school. What I learned from that failure was that you need to broaden who is on board and who benefits from an override vote. At the time, we did not have the support of public safety, and that was a critical error. So I learned on my first actual mission in politics that you need to be about broadening and working in collaboration with a broad array of people. So I would say that would be the failure that I learned from, and actually was able to survive because I ran for a state representative that following summer, that same year, actually, and won election to the State House.
Ms. Tran?
Thanks. So I have a pretty unique relationship with failure in that I look at it as an opportunity to improve. That dates back to athletics. You know, I was a competitive athlete. I was a Division I volleyball player at Georgetown. I even coached my Lowell High School for a bunch of years, and I think you just realize when you have a loss, you wring out all the lessons that are possible, and you get better the next game. But on a more serious note, in my professional career, I was the only female executive at a high-tech company, male-dominated high-tech company, as most of them are. And when you work at a startup, there's enormous pressure for you to deliver results on a quarterly basis, you know, to your investors, to your board of directors. And when you're a startup and you're reliant on that next round of cash, you know, you have to figure out what your strategy is going to be in a very short timeline. So, you know, we tried a lot of things. Some we were ahead of market. We missed some sales forecasts, and there were a bunch of failures that, you know, you are a part of in a startup environment. But one of the things I learned, and I take this lesson with me through life, is, you know, many times we just try to be great at everything. That is the downfall of so many startups, is that they're not willing to focus. They're not willing to make the necessary trade-offs so that they can be successful. I've learned even as a working mom, you know, you have to be willing to be great at some things and bad at others, because if you try to be great at everything, it just leads to exhausted mediocrity. So I think failure, when you fail, you realize that there are huge lessons to be learned, and you get back up and you're better the next day.
Yeah. Ambassador?
Oh, where do you start? You know, it's my entire 20s. I was a really awkward gay kid who didn't know what he was meant to do in the world, who graduated from college, whose father was a very successful banker, and all he knew in the world, meaning me, all I knew in the world was that I did not want to be a banker. So I moved Boston banking. How can you get as far away from that as possible? Los Angeles entertainment industry. So I moved to LA and thinking that I could figure out what I was meant to do in this world, figure out my place. And that entire chapter was a series of failures. Where I hit rock bottom, and I tried to pull myself out from time to time. I had some very difficult personal relationships during that time, and it wasn't until I applied to business school, thinking that would get me out. I did not get in, and I found myself in my mid to late 20s hitting rock bottom. And it wasn't until I quit my job and I told my parents that I was probably going to need a little help, but I needed to quit my job because I needed to find my purpose. And I walked into John Kerry's presidential campaign office in California and said, put me to work as an unpaid volunteer after quitting my job. And it was in that moment where I balanced my head and my heart, meaning I finally figured out what I was good at. And I was fired up about it too. It's those magical moments in life. But those failures make you, as Lori was saying, just make you so much stronger and makes the journey so much more valuable.
The recent murder of Yarmouth police officer Sean Gannon has sparked debate of how we should deal with cop killers. Would you support legislation in Congress that makes killing a police officer a federal crime, which could be subject to the death penalty? Senator?
Absolutely not. I believe that death penalty is one of those issues that you have a moral compass on, either for or against. I have voted against the death penalty. Under no circumstances would I support that. Look, I'm from a law enforcement family. My dad was an FBI agent. My dad carried a service revolver. He was involved in hijackings and many other things over the years, stakeouts, etc. I think that we need to be about supporting our police, and we need to be about making sure that we are tough on those who would go after law enforcement with intent to injure. I just voted recently to up mandatory minimums in that one instance with regards to looking to severely injure a police officer. But I do not believe that we are going to accomplish a decrease in gun violence towards police officers by instituting the death penalty. And in fact, there's been research that bears that out. The 5 worst states in terms of police deaths are ones that actually have death penalty on the books. So it is not a deterrent, and I just believe firmly that the death penalty should not be utilized under any circumstances in this country.
Mr. Hand?
Yeah, the murder of Officer Gannon is just, it's heartbreaking, and I think it's one that, you know, it's a reminder of the service that policemen and women do for us each day. I am not for the death penalty in any circumstances, and what I am for, though, is getting Congress back to work. When Congress doesn't work, our police officers are actually disproportionately in harm's way than anybody else that serves, than any other public servant I know. When we don't have legislation on gun control or opioids or immigration, they're caught in the crosshairs, and we have to put them in you know, set up the conditions for them to thrive and for them to be safe. But no, I'm not for the death penalty.
Ambassador.
Look, of course, and I'll echo my colleagues here. If any time a member of law enforcement is murdered, it's an absolutely tragic day, and the perpetrator must meet the full extent of the law. But I'm opposed to the death penalty under any circumstances, and that's where my values are. And so, no, I do not support that.
Mr. Coe.
I am opposed to the death penalty, and quite frankly, in the cases that we just cite, it's the easy way out for these people. They should be locked up, thrown away the key for the rest of their lives.
Please take a moment to tell us something about each of the other candidates on this stage that impresses you.
This could be my favorite question. Thank you. We don't get an opportunity nearly enough to say good things about each other. So happy Mother's Day, Barbara.
Thank you. Same to you.
Thank you.
I'm going to go grocery shopping tomorrow morning. I haven't done it in a while.
I'm going to stay in my pajamas for a little bit.
And her son was even nice enough to drive her here today.
That's right.
You know, I love hearing the story of Senator L'Italian, why she got into public service. You know, the advocacy for her son, I think, is an inspiration to all of us, and there's a nobility there that I think we all can learn from. For Rufus, he's got unbridled enthusiasm for what is, you know, I think for what we all hope for, which is a better world and a better government. And I do love hearing him talk about that. He also has an authenticity to him that, you know, not a lot of people in this business have. Danko, you know, he's got an enormously hard work ethic. Just the number of marathons he's run makes me feel like an underachiever. But that takes enormous, you know, mental fortitude and a lot of hard work. I actually was driving home last night, late last night, and I saw Dan running, and I was reminded, like, he's how hard of a worker he is. So yeah, those are my summation.
Oh God,
colleagues.
We're gonna blush, I think, during this conversation. I know we've never done this before, just so you know. So Senator L'Italian, listen, as a gay man, we've had this conversation before, and my family was working very closely with mass equality, as I know you were, and I think that during those early years of the marriage equality movement, when we were desperate for leadership, there were a few folks who stepped up, and those of us remember that. Those of us who have been privileged enough to get married remember the early champions, and I'm proud to say that my family was one, and you were one as well. So I appreciate that. Lori, listen, I've just had so much, as someone who just comes home every single day and is so exhausted. Seeing you, going back to the Mother's Day thing, seeing you with your daughters at things like the Women's March, and I am in awe in so many ways that you can be a mom to young girls and still do this. And seeing their faces is just so clear that they're proud of you, too, and proud of this process. And I just think it's awesome. And Dan, I mean, God, you know, Going back to the marathon thing. So let's be clear. So I've run 2 marathons, and I was laid up for a week. But after both ones, I'm like, yeah, you're in way better shape than I am. But and it just speaks to something about you that I'm so impressed by, which is just a determination, a drive, a constant desire to make yourself and also society better, to push yourself. I'm in awe of that too, and it's just awesome. The idea that you could run a marathon and do the campaign the next day. I just literally my legs and my knees, I would have had to have ice on them for weeks. It's just awesome.
Good, thank you. No, this is the best. Can we just keep going?
Yeah, we can skip the rest of the questions.
Senator, you were my state rep growing up, and you know the conversations that we have in these debates and these forums is all true of what you've done. I mean, you work closely with my family on the Challenger Soccer League growing up, and it's personal to you, and that drive is every day, comes from your heart, and I've always admired it. Lori, I should call you Chief because I respect anyone who is a Chief of Staff. It's a really difficult job, and you know there's kind of 2 separate things when you're a Chief of Staff. It's making sure you're pushing the legislative agenda forward, but it's also making sure that in the case Congressman Meehan is in the best light, and you're constantly pushing him, and you did an amazing job of that, and it's just incredible. And Ambassador, representing us on the world stage is something that is incredibly complex, is incredibly difficult, and especially when it comes to the kind of the millennial generation, to see a younger person in that role, and the leadership that you did there was absolutely phenomenal and inspired a generation of people, I think, into public service that I know was deeply meaningful for you. It wasn't just about being ambassador, it was about inspiring the next generation to serve. Not to mention the fact that being the representative from the U.S. the day after the President Trump was elected was probably one of the most difficult moments of your life, and I'm sure and I know that you handled it with incredible grace.
Thank you. Thank you.
Senator.
Great. Yeah, I think all 3 of you show great energy, enthusiasm, vision, desire to lead, want to, step into this role. I admire everyone that's decided to run for office this year, and I think that any one of you would be someone that I could support over the Republican candidate that's looming out there, waiting to see who wins this primary. So that's what I would say.
Ambassador Gifford.
Yes, sir.
Why you?
Oh, closing statements. Sorry, we're all kind of choked up now. Now I have to get serious again. All right. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you so much, and thanks for putting this event on. So, listen, since I launched this campaign 6 months ago now, I can't believe it's been that long. We've been hitting the road, put over 10,000 miles on my car, gone to all 37 cities and towns in this amazing district. Been to this part of the district, Greater Fitchburg, more than 40 times. We showed up in places like the Cozy Corner and River Styx and Boulder and Chibo and all of the amazing places right here in Fitchburg. Came in with a pad and paper, sat down with people, and just started listening and asking questions. Because why do we do this? Is because I believe that there is a massive, massive deficit of trust that exists between people and government, people and politicians, people and institutions. And if we are going to try to achieve some of the big ideas that we've discussed around this table today, the first thing we have to do is actually get people to believe in the system once again. We have got to get people to participate. And how do you build that faith and trust back? You do it with sort of democracy in its purest form, meaning human-to-human conversations. So we are going to approach this campaign one person at a time and win that trust and respect that way. Listen, when I first met Barack Obama, it was January 2007. It was at a reception at Teddy Kennedy's Senate office, and I had a 30-second conversation with the then senator from Illinois. And I knew in that moment that I was going to work for him for 2 years. Why was it? Why was that? Because I wanted in part to believe in the best of the United States of America. That even considering our history with race, that we had the ability to elect an African-American president, and we did it. We did it twice. We have to remember that it wasn't that long ago that we were inspired by the work of our government. We were talking about universal health care on the federal level. We were talking about legitimate climate change. We were passing marriage equality, and that's just the beginning. And that is the kind of campaign that we are going to run. We are going to be hopeful and optimistic and aspirational and focus on the best of the United States of America, because we know it's out there and we can get back again. And I humbly ask for your support. Thank you so much.
Exactly.
Oh, and come see us, Fitchburg, our Fitchburg office, 444 Main Street, right above Shaq's.
Exactly 2 minutes. Good
Yeah.
job.
Very good.
Thank you. You know, my family comes from two different parts of this world, Lebanon and Korea. They couldn't have looked more different. They couldn't have spoken a more different language, but they had just one thing in common, and that's they believed deeply in the American dream. So they both came to the United States. My great-grandfather came to Lawrence, Massachusetts. He worked in the mill. He had a good, well-paying job. His son, my grandfather, joined the military, eventually opened up Aragioneer Associates in Lawrence, Massachusetts, that exists to this day with my mom and her two brothers, and they lived the American dream. As a result, there's a Korean Lebanese guy, the two most random countries in the world, who has a chance to be a congressman from his hometown district. That American dream story is unique, but the American dream is not unique to me. So many of us have that same American dream story. But the reality is, under this president, that American dream story is under attack. And so we need to stand up for the values that make the American dream possible. Good quality health care for everyone. A job that pays well so no one who works 40 hours a week has to live in poverty. A $15 minimum wage, pay equity. And when I was chief of staff to Mayor Walsh, we made sure we stood up to this administration. When this president tried to pull out of the Paris Climate Accords and did, we stood up and said that we would be carbon neutral by 2050. When this president instituted a racist travel ban, we opened up City Hall and said that anyone who's feeling threatened is welcome and we will protect you. And we need to continue fighting for common sense gun safety in this country, fighting against Secretary DeVos's insane attacks on our public education system. That is what this country is all about. Standing up for the values that we believe in. And I promise you that if you join our campaign, if you learn more about what we're about, I'll make sure that that American dream story, the one that made my life possible, and the one that made all of our lives possible, will be around for generations to come. So thank you, and let's go.
Senator Italian.
Thank you. Well, as I just mentioned, you know, the other three candidates are eminently qualified to run for office. You know, everyone that is running in this seat are wonderful Democrats. The big difference, as I see it, is that I'm the person that has been a legislator over the last 15 years. I served 15 years ago with Emil Gogin from this area. You know, I serve right now with John Zlotnick and with Steve Hay. I've served with your current mayor in Fitchburg, Steve DiNatale. I've been about doing the work, passing the legislation, making sure that people with dyslexia aren't falling behind, making sure that kids struggling with autism are getting the medical insurance coverage they need to have a life of purpose. You know, working on right now an Alzheimer's omnibus bill, in part due to my own personal experience of having to care for my mom for the last 7 years of her life. I chair Elder Affairs. This isn't theory for me. This isn't grandiose plans, and you know, it's great to be aspirational, but I've actually done the hard work of being a legislator. I know how to pass bills. I know how to get involved in negotiations. I know how to block things, as in the case of trying to take away equal marriage back when the eyes of the world were looking at Massachusetts in 2004. I'm proud to be endorsed by the mass nurses because I've fought for health care. I'm proud to be endorsed by the single-payer folks because I am the person they think is most likely to lead on a Medicare for All program down in Washington, D.C. I'm proud to have the support of the nurses, the teachers, the Fitchburg Fire Department, and Steve Kerrigan, who dropped out of this race and was the candidate that represented this geographic area. He believes that I'm the person that is going to be about doing the work, not about who my boss has been, not about dropping names, but about doing the hard work of being a legislator and representing areas like Fitchburg, like Gardner. I represent very similar areas up in Lawrence and represented Haverhill and Methuen, so I understand what it's like to have to help people day in and day out that are struggling with evictions and with jobs and with education. And I've done the work, and so I would say that that is why I want to continue the mission I started quite humbly as a mom for my son Rudy 15 years ago, and I want to take that mission to Washington, D.C. for you.
Mr. Hand.
Thank you. This administration has been a disaster for working-class families like the one I grew up in. About the only good thing I can say about the last 18 months is that it's inspired people who have never thought to run for office before, women like me, to get off the sidelines and say enough. I'm honored to be a part of this talented field of candidates. I am every day. But there are clear differences between us, and the outcome of this election matters. I've lived in this district my whole life. I grew up in a union household, and I went to public schools. I didn't move into this district because I saw a political opportunity. This is personal for me. I'm running to be a voice for the families that I grew up with and for the families that my children are growing up with. Too many people are moving into the district to run, and frankly, too many people are raising money primarily from special interests or for people who have no ties to this district. We've raised the majority of our support from people who live here, people like you, because I want the voters of this district to know that I'm accountable to them. I'm in this for them, for you. Look, I know what it takes to be effective down on Capitol Hill because I've been there. I know what it takes to build and create an office that's responsive to the needs of communities like Fitchburg because I've done it. I intend to use all the fortitude that was required to get a scholarship to play volleyball in college, to rise up in a male-dominated tech world, and to create my own small business, to go fight Trump's divisive policies in Washington. I was born here, raised here, and I've stayed here. My story is your story, and I humbly ask for your vote on September 4th.
Thank you. We're up against the buzzer.
That was perfect.